Pricing Discontinuities. Subtitle, Eat as much sushi as you can now. What I've been thinking about with the global financial crisis Mark II, which is a train wreck currently unfolding, is this idea of whether pricing signals actually work all the time and whose fault it is. And I see a similarity between what's happened with Greece and Italy and what has been happening and is currently happening, although it's not very noticeable, with the biomass of fish in the oceans. And look, I'll give you the fish issue and then let's talk about the financial issue. We don't see the price of raw fish changing a lot. There may be small changes, there might be minor adjustments due to scarcity, even though a large part of the fish stocks since 1950 have just disappeared. We're talking 60 or 70% of biomass in the world's oceans has just gone. We've eaten it all. That hasn't really been reflected in price signals. Now, I wonder why? It's pretty clear. The cost of taking a ship, a fishing boat, out from, let's say, South Korea to nearby waters, and South Korea, I'm just saying for argument's sake, could be Massachusetts for all I care, out to the mid-Pacific, in the case of Massachusetts, the Atlantic, those costs aren't substantially different. Most costs of fishing come from the time spent, the labour costs, but distance doesn't really factor a lot into the costs. It's like, how much does milk add to the cost of a coffee? Not a hell of a lot. Now, what that means is, as fishing boats are going further and further out, they are depleting more fish stocks, yet that is not being reflected in a price signal, because the incremental cost of going further out is not substantial. Yet the majority of fish stocks since 1950 have been depleted. So very soon, we'll finish. There'll be almost no more fish, or no commercially viable stocks of fish. So eat your sushi now. Yet this hasn't been reflected in the pricing signal. Why? Because the cost function is perverse. The amount you fish doesn't necessarily get reflected in the supply function. Okay, the supply curve. How does this apply to GFC2? How does this apply to the currently occurring train wreck in Europe? When I think about who is to blame for the Greek situation, the Italian situation, it's a cheap shot to say that it's the Greeks or the Italians that are to blame. Of course, the Greek government, Greek society, to the extent to which it suspended disbelief, is to blame for spending beyond its means, for seeing, oh, look, funds are cheap, let's borrow to buggery. But there's a signal failure here, a pricing signal failure. And it's exactly the same as we see with the fish. Why is it that bond markets did not realise that Greece and Italy to some extent did not have the capacity to sustain this debt indefinitely? Because if bond markets had realised that, they would have priced that in to the bonds. So we would have seen the price, i.e. interest rates, for Greek and Italian borrowing going up progressively over time. That would have provided a strong signal to Greece and Italy that borrowing is unsustainable. Yet, for much longer than would be appropriate, interest rates didn't move. There was, if you like, a discontinuity. The bond markets believed or were unwilling to properly price the fact that the risk of borrowing by Greece is not the same as the risk of borrowing by Germany. So, are the Greeks to blame? Yes. Are bond markets to blame? Yes. So who needs to suffer? It's a cheap shot to say that the Greeks should suffer. People who lent to them and did not price the risk of default also deserve to suffer. I don't care about those French banks. So long as you guarantee deposits to people who had no choice about those decisions that were made with their funds, the banks should be allowed to fail. those ones that made those bad pricing decisions. I know this is not simple, and this is a top of the mind, spur of the moment thought. But the bond markets did not price risk appropriately. So why should the borrower be the only one to bear the cost for not being given a proper price signal? While we're on that subject, this is not a time for austerity. We need to make these economies productive. Devalue, that's one way. Write off the debt, well, you borrowed to someone who couldn't pay back, you should take a serious haircut. So basically defaulting, I think, is a good strategy for Greece and Italy, and it will teach the bond markets to price risk more appropriately in future. One more point. The European Central Bank and the Bundesbank have this view, or at least the Bundesbank does, Germans in general do, have a view that we really don't want to get into the 1920s again. We do not want to print money because that's inflationary. And come across to the European Central Bank. Its mandate is to maintain price stability. Well, we're entering a deflationary cycle. We can see that already. Just look at Australian property prices. But we're seeing the start of a deflationary phase of the business cycle. How do you maintain prices? How do you maintain price stability? Well, you want inflation to counteract the deflation. Printing money is appropriate. The German reluctance to print is conditioned on their experience in the 1920s, when their world went to hell in a handbasket, and progressively the rest of ours did as well. Okay, but there was also a problem of too little too late in the US at that time. Contractionary economic policies are not what we need. We need to get these countries producing. We need people to have the confidence to consume. Austerity doesn't achieve that.